We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning, Holly M. Barker. Holly M. Barker served as the advisor to the Republic of the Marshall Islands Embassy for 18 years and now teaches anthropology as a full-time lecturer at the University of Washington. She is the co-author, along with Barbara Rose Johnson, of the book The Consequential Damages of Nuclear War, the Rongelap Report. Co-author of Half-Lives and Half-Truths, Confronting the Radioactive Legacies of the Cold War. And here to talk about her book, Bravo for the Marshallese, Regaining Control in a Post-Nuclear, Post-Colonial World. Start out, tell us, what was your motivation in writing your book, Bravo for the Marshallese?
Yeah, well, my motivation was I started work, as you were saying, with the Embassy of the Marshall Islands in Washington, D.C., and one of their efforts was to try to educate Congress about what happened with the nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands. And in order to get that done, they had to better understand their history themselves. And so the Marshall Islands government asked me to conduct research, to go out and interview people in the Marshall Islands who had been profoundly affected by the U.S. nuclear weapons testing and to document their stories. And then to also look at U.S. government documents that had been declassified about what the consequences of the testing were and try to merge those together to create a better understanding of what happened. For decades, outside researchers, primarily the U.S. government, came to the Marshall Islands and did their own research and took that knowledge away without giving it back to the Marshallese. This was an effort, and the motivation behind it was to give this history to the Marshall Islands and to give it back to them so that the Marshallese could decide for themselves what they wanted to do with it. And so I wrote this book at the request of the Marshall Islands and the people most affected so that their story would be documented. And so I could give it back to them, to their political leaders, to their community leaders, for them to advocate for themselves in terms of what they thought were the next steps of what they need to address the consequences of the testing.
Did you have any sense of what you would find prior to your beginning this search?
You know, I don't think I ever fully knew how deep it would be. You know, I knew that the radiation had affected people. I knew that it had caused illness. I knew that it had caused changes in the environment. But when you go out there and you live side by side with the people and your life gets intertwined with them and they become your friends, and you see those effects, you understand it on a much, much deeper level. And I think as somebody who's done research there and worked there for more than 20 years, these are now my friends who are affected. These are my friends who are dying of cancer. These are people that I love and care about deeply. And so it takes on a new level of depth and personal commitment, I guess.
So give us some history here. Tell us about when did the tests begin? How long did they go on? Paint us a picture.
Yeah. So after World War II, the United Nations gave essentially the Marshall Islands to the U.S. government and asked the U.S. to be the administrators of those islands to take care of the people and protect their well-being. The U.S. saw this as an opportunity to create a strategic outpost for the U.S. because the Marshall Islands is extremely remote. It's, thousands of miles away from both right in the middle of Russia and the United States. So in an area that was geographically isolated, far from the public eye, a place where the U.S. could engage in top secret medical and military operations that it didn't want others to know about. And so the U.S. saw its new outpost as a place to conduct its nuclear testing. And so from 1946 to 1958, the U.S. conducted 67 atmospheric nuclear weapons tests in the Marshall Islands. Each of the tests was above ground. Each of the tests was to design as much local fallout from the radiation as possible so that the U.S. government could essentially create a laboratory out there. If it could keep the radiation in the Marshall Islands, then it could study what the effects of the radiation were on the people and the environment. And so the Marshall Islands became a very unique location for the U.S. to conduct these experiments.
What did the U.S. tell the Marshallese? How did they get them to agree to this?
Yeah, so, it's interesting because I think initially at the start of this testing program, a lot of the U.S. researchers didn't fully comprehend what the outcomes were going to be of these tests. And so there's some great video footage that of the U.S. Navy going out to the atoll of Bikini, and Bikini was one of the ground zero locations of a naval commander going out there and saying, we're going to take something bad and turn it into something good, and we want the help of you, and God wants us to do this. Are you on the side with America and with God? And the leader of the Bikinians stands up and says, well, of course, if everything's in God's hands, things have to be good, and of course we'll do this with you. The Marshallese had just endured a very brutal military occupation by Japan before, during World War II. The United States was seen as a friend, as an ally. The Marshallese were very anxious to show their appreciation to the U.S. government for ending that Japanese occupation. And when a friend says, we've got God on our side and we want to turn something bad into something good to help with world peace, the Marshallese, of course, not fully understanding what a nuclear bomb was, as most people of that era, they capitulated and they gave their lands to the U.S. for testing. But once the Marshallese did start to understand what nuclear weapons testing involved, they protested vigorously, and they did everything they could to make the world know how unhappy they were with the outcomes. And so after the testing started, they started complaining to the United Nations and writing to the United Nations and requesting that the testing stopped and complaining to the U.S. They didn't sit by passively and quietly. They're not like silent victims. They did everything within their power to stop it. But the power and the might and the political and military interests of the U.S. Allowed the U.S. to continue.
And you've done extensive interviews with people who were affected directly by this. Yes,
that's right, Mike. Yeah, I was a Peace Corps volunteer initially in the Marshall Islands, and so I was teaching English and living on an island there. And I lived with Marshallese family and learned the language. After I left the Peace Corps, kind of thinking, okay, what do skills in Marshallese language, where does that get me? That ended up landing me in Washington, D.C., working for their embassy. And so the embassy, again, asked me to go and conduct these interviews. And so I conducted them all in Marshallese. More than 200 interviews of people who were living downwind from the testing program. And so I took Marshallese leaders into the community, and together we conducted and documented these histories and then gave the histories back to the people that we interviewed at the time so that they could also have copies of them to pass on to their children or whomever.
Which my understanding is kind of the opposite of what the U.S. did. They would not allow them to see what the results were of different tests, things like that.
Yes, that's right.
So when the U.S. conducted these tests, did they move the Marshallese to other locations?
Yeah, it's a good question. So initially, for some of the smaller tests, they did. When the testing started in 1946, they started moving communities who either lived on the ground zero locations or who the communities that lived downwind as a precaution because they weren't sure what was going to happen. So they moved entire communities, several of them. Each of the communities within the Marshall Islands has its own story and history related to the testing program. But then when the U.S. was getting ready to test its largest detonation ever, the Bravo test, which was March 1st, 1954, and it was planned as the biggest and the dirtiest test, the U.S. weather folks who were working at the time knew that the winds were headed towards an inhabited atoll. And they knew that the power of this test would carry radiation that far. And the U.S. government purposely decided not to relocate that community before detonating the test. And again, knowing full well that the winds would carry in the direction of those communities. They even went so far to put a U.S. naval vessel anchored right next to the inhabited community so that once a detonation occurred and once, predictably, the radiation followed the wind to the inhabited community and blanketed them with radiation, that U.S. naval ship sat there. And instead of evacuating the people and taking them, away, as it steamed away, it left them there knowing that they had met the radiation, and left them for more than 2 days, while steaming off to safety itself. And so the U.S. knew the winds were going to carry radiation to these people, left those people there, and then didn't go back and get them for another 2.5 days. When they did go back to get them, they evacuated them and then enrolled them into a highly secret military medical program called Project 4.1. And this is something that we just discovered when the Clinton administration started declassifying documents about the Cold War. Project 4.1 was a biomedical experiment to understand the effects of radiation on human beings, so that if the U.S. troops were to be exposed to radiation, or if the American public was to be exposed to radiation from a Soviet or other threat, then the U.S. military would better understand what radiation would do to the people who are exposed. The Marshallese were essentially the guinea pigs for the U.S. military to know what radiation does to people. In this Project 4.1, it was a combination of studying what is radiation in the form of fallout, what does that do to people, how does that affect their bodies, what happens if you put a population into an environment that's highly contaminated and they eat radioactive foods, what does that do to their bodies? What happens if you inject a person with radiation directly into their bloodstream, in which U.S. researchers did with the Marshallese, so that they could compare what are the effects if you get it on your skin from fallout versus if we put it into your bloodstream. In other cases, they gave Marshallese radioactive substances to drink, so putting it into their digestive system. And so the Marshallese, while they may have been given permission certainly to do the nuclear tests and to try initially, as they were trying to give permission to their friends to secure, the military might that would allow world peace, as the U.S. put it to them, they did not give any permission whatsoever to be a part of these medical programs, and they no consent whatsoever. And so for more than 40 years, the Marshallese, unknown to them, they always had concerns about being prodded and treated as guinea pigs for scientists, but they really didn't understand till those documents were declassified the extent of this medical experimentation that they were a part of.
So that project and other projects like it, they were being monitored for that 40-year period?
Exactly. And so, in some cases, during some of these interviews, I had Marshallese tell me that they had burns from the radiation that went through their skin all the way down to their bones. And they were in agony, just sheer agony. And when they were put into the Project 4.1 and they were with a doctor, the doctors took photographs of them. They didn't give them any pain relief. The idea was not to treat or assist in the healing of the patients. It was to document what the radiation does. And so they didn't necessarily understand it all at the time, but once those documents were declassified and they understood that it was a medical experiment, I think it made the picture more complete for the Marshallese.
And talk a bit about what the U.S. has done, its response since those documents have come out, as well as was there any response prior to those documents coming out?
Yeah. There hasn't... The Marshallese have filed a petition with the U.S. Congress. It's called the Change Circumstances Petition, based on these new documents that have come out. There's a provision in the agreement between the Marshall Islands and the U.S. that the Marshallese can petition Congress for additional assistance to address their health and environmental needs if they can demonstrate that U.S. assistance has not been adequate so far. And so the Marshallese submitted a petition to Congress requesting what they thought was adequate health care and cleanup, using sort of a U.S. standard in terms of what the U.S. provides to its own citizens whose land is contaminated or whose health is impacted by radiation. And the U.S. government has held hearings in Congress about this and created a record about it. But the executive branch has denied that there are changed circumstances, and in Congress there really has not been the political will to respond meaningfully to these requests by the Marshallese. And again, the Marshallese are not taking this quietly or passively. They have very active representatives in Washington, D.C., in New York and elsewhere, and they're making all of the requests to all the right people, and they've documented and justified their requests. It's just that the political will isn't necessarily there. There are a lot of communities, honestly, who have been affected by the Cold War. Sadly and tragically, the Marshallese are not the only ones. And whether it be the tribes in Hanford or the downwinders from the Nevada test site, people in Japan, elsewhere, there are communities all around the world whose lives were profoundly affected by the Cold War. We don't think of the Cold War as having casualties, but there are tens of thousands of people who have been affected by the mining of uranium, the production and testing of bombs, and these are communities who all need assistance. The Marshallese, because they're not constituents of the U.S., they've been free, independent from the U.S. since 1986. That UN trusteeship ended in 1986. They're now an independent country, and so they don't have constituents. No member of Congress is responsible for the Marshallese, and so it makes it difficult to get in line as many of these communities need assistance. And so the Marshallese often fall to the side of political interests.
So you were talking about that they were seeking additional compensation. What kind of compensation did they get originally, and what did the U.S. do to clean up this horrifying mess?
Yeah, initially a very small group of people, those who are enrolled in Project 4.1, they're able to get a small amount of medical care in which U.S. doctors will travel to the Marshall Islands, and now they're beginning to get Marshallese doctors who can treat these communities. They'll provide them health care for their radiogenic illnesses if it's related to radiation exposure, not their total health or well-being, but just a piece of it, and just for very few communities. The whole Marshall Islands was exposed to radiation. The U.S. government has, in its law, very neatly drawn a tight box around who's exposed and when, to say that, if you were exposed to radiation from the Bravo test, which was the biggest, of course, on March 1st, 1954, if you were exposed to that radiation, you're eligible for health care. Anybody else in the country isn't, even though there are another 66 atmospheric tests on top of that with winds going every different direction. Again, everybody's affected. And so the U.S. has provided very minimal assistance. What I find so disturbing, and, as an American citizen, just thinking about the activities of my own government in this country, still now there's no oncologist in the Marshall Islands. And to me, that's just criminal, because these awful events happened in the past. Historically, the U.S. did horrible things in the Marshall Islands. The Marshallese have essentially endured nuclear war for 12 years straight. The equivalent to the testing in the Marshall Islands, that one test, the Bravo shot alone, is the same as 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. And so many people have seen images of Hiroshima and have an understanding of what that damage is. That one bomb, again, being the equivalent of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. If you look at the total 12-year testing program, it's the same as testing 2 Hiroshima bombs every single day in the Marshall Islands for 12 years. And the fact that the Marshallese have had to endure this, because of U.S. responsibility. The one thing that the U.S. really could do meaningfully here would be to provide adequate health care. Knowing that radiation causes cancer, knowing that radiation causes mutagenic changes to offspring, to not have the health capacity for these people to deal, it means that the indignities and the injustices of the nuclear weapons testing are allowed to continue in the Marshall Islands. They didn't end in 1958 when the testing stopped, because the healthcare system's not in place. And so the violence, the structural violence that's in the inadequacy of the healthcare continues. And the Marshallese still suffer the effects of the testing program because radiation is still in their environment and still affecting the health of everybody in the nation.
It sounds like the U.S. provided money for their monitoring program of the Marshallese,
Yes.
yet at the same time put no money or minimal amount for their health care.
Yes, the priority was on extracting knowledge to help with the military agenda, and certainly not with providing for the well-being of the people.
You have amazing and disturbing photos in both your books, Bravo for the Marshallese, of the situation there, of the external things that one can see, and also the book Consequential Damages of Nuclear War. But one of the things you'd given a talk recently at the UW's War and Global Health Conference, and you were talking about the effects on women who were pregnant and had miscarriages. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that was one of the most startling things to uncover from the interviews. Marshallese have always have miscarriages and stillbirths because there are Marshallese words in the language for them, like ko, which means a stillbirth. And so the fact that there's a Marshallese words means that they've always had these experiences. And so when I went out and started interviewing the women, I looked very closely at the language they were using to describe their reproductive abnormalities that they started experiencing after the testing. And what I discovered is that Marshallese women have created a whole new vocabulary to discuss the kind of birth outcomes that they're having. They've had to invent whole new words to describe what had never taken place historically in the islands. And so the language is evidence that these are new experiences for the Marshallese. And, they use words like clam baby to say what I gave birth to looks like the inside of a clam, or I gave birth to a husked coconut, because, again, these are things in nature, non-human words to describe what appear to be almost like non-human offspring to them. They're such abnormalities. Probably the most common would be the grape babies that women describe. And grape babies are in hydatiform molar pregnancies, which is a very rare and unusual birth outcome in the United States and in the developed world. But in the Marshall Islands, it's prevalent enough that people had to attach a name to it to use all over the islands. Grape babies are, when mitosis happens after a woman gets pregnant, at some point the cells stop dividing and the cells get extremely large to the size of grapes or golf balls or, in some cases, softballs. And women feel like they're pregnant and show all the signs of pregnancy, but towards the end, they'll deliver what looks to them like a bunch of grapes. And wherever I went in the Marshall Islands, people would talk about grape babies. And the closer that women live to the ground zero locations, the more prevalent these grape babies and other outcomes were. And so the language is indicative of the experiences of the women. And what I found really disturbing is a lot of these women just suffered this silently by themselves. What the U.S. government researchers were interested in were more the cancers and the thyroids. They weren't interested in studying the reproductive abnormalities. And so the women didn't necessarily understand that it was linked to the radiation. And there wasn't any knowledge or education about why this was happening to them. And in some cases, there was a lot of stigmatization by the men who questioned why their women were giving birth, and a lot of suffering that these women endured because of their reproductive outcomes.
And it had occurred to me when you were giving the talk initially at the UW talking about this, that this seems to have also been repeated in other parts of the world. For instance, the downwinders here within the United States, in Iraq with the depleted uranium use there, you see similar accounts to what you have reported.
Yeah. Chernobyl's another location. Radiation is mutagenic, and so it shows up in the offspring and will continue for several generations. In the case of the Marshallese, the health care is only provided to the people who are exposed to the fallout from the actual testing. But one of the Marshallese biggest concerns are for their children. And so even the people who were alive during the testing program and who are eligible for health care, it torments them that they can't take their own children to health care because they're not eligible for it. And so they see the effects. I mean, in some of these communities, you visibly see the effects of radiation in the people. You see it in the stunted growth, the missing limbs, the scars on their necks where their thyroids were removed. I mean, you really visibly can see the radiation effects. And so it's just another heartbreak for the people who were first affected to then know that their genes carry these mutations that affect their children, and then not being able to provide their children with the health care. And as a mother, I can't even imagine what that would be like to know that my exposure affected my children and then not have any means to provide health care to my children. It deepens the sorrow.
So what is happening now with the Marshallese? Are they continue to petition both the U.S. and the UN for support?
Yes, they're still doing everything they can to raise these issues. And if anybody's interested in what they can do to help, certainly contacting elected officials and asking them to give the people in the Marshall Islands the same standards of health care and cleanup that they provide to U.S. citizens. The Marshallese are not asking for the world here. All that they're asking for is an adequate health care and cleanup, something that the U.S. government has not provided in the past. And just to give you an example of that, the Department of Labor has a compensation and medical care program for Department of Energy workers who are exposed to radiation. And U.S. Department of Energy workers who worked in the Marshall Islands doing cleanup and were exposed to radiation, those U.S. citizens are eligible to receive up to $125,000 in compensation and health care. Marshallese who are employed by the Department of Energy in the Marshall Islands to do the very same work as those U.S. citizens are not eligible to participate in this program because they're not U.S. citizens. And so it's just an example of the inequities. What the Marshallese are asking for is the same treatment, the same level of care and consideration as U.S. citizens. And so if folks want to contact their elected officials, I know the Marshallese would sure appreciate it.
All right. And finally, there is a connection to a local, one of your students in a local band?
Absolutely, yes. And I know KEXP music lovers will appreciate this. There's a great local band called Ravenna Woods. And the lead singer there, Chris Cunningham, who came and did an in-studio here at KEXP, former student of mine, went out to the Marshall Islands and taught English there for a year and learned all about this nuclear history. One of the band's recent songs, Ghosts, has a music video that's all about the nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands. So I encourage listeners to go and check out that music video, Ghosts by Ravenna Woods.
Well, unfortunately, with that, we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks so much, Mike.